We turn now to the critical question about the origin of the coronavirus. Did it evolve in nature, or was it man-made in a Chinese lab? And there's a third theory as well, that it occurred naturally but then accidentally escaped a Wuhan lab.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have.
There's enormous evidence that that's where this began. I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan.
It's very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated.
That was President Trump, Secretary of State Pompeo, and top infectious disease Dr. Anthony Fauci weighing in. And now to help us try to make some sense of all of this, we'd like to bring in Tom Bossert, President Trump's former Homeland Security advisor and ABC News contributor. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Lindsay.
So Trump and Pompeo, they suggest that there is a link between the virus and a Wuhan lab. Dr. Fauci seems to knock that down entirely and has said that the science indicates it evolved in nature. Who's right, and what do we know?
Yeah, well, it's very important to be precise about this language because they could both be right. They could also both be wrong at the same time. And here's what I mean by that. The virus itself has been studied by scientists, including in the Trump administration under the NIH. And Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, has come out and scientifically concluded with a report that they published almost a month ago that it wasn't made by man. It wasn't a man-made, genomic kind of conception of humans. It was naturally, maybe brewing, so to speak, for maybe even years, if not months. Now, the question is, did it then transmit to human beings from the market, or were they looking at this naturally occurring virus in the lab and then either intentionally or through some accident release it from that lab? So the question is not about origin of the virus. That's not man-made. The question is about whether it was released accidentally or whether it was, a natural occurrence. And that's the question being investigated now.
As we know, this virus has already killed tens of thousands of Americans. Do you envision political or social fallout from suggesting that a Chinese lab is to blame?
I do. That's exactly why it's so important to be careful with that language between the president, the secretary of state, and Dr. Fauci. They're all saying something similar, but to be very clear, the fallout from a mistake or an accidental release will be, somewhat significant, but perhaps obviously not that level of war or conflict. We've had this problem in our country where after 9/11, we had doctors in laboratories not properly caring for the anthrax that they were working on and studying, and that could have been a biolaboratory security concern. Certainly, we could see a biolaboratory safety concern in China, and we'd want international agreement to improve those standards and those practices so that negligence and mishaps don't happen. But if it were intentionally released, it's not intentionally created, but intentionally released, that would be tantamount to the largest biowarfare we've ever seen on the planet. And so we have to be very careful to make sure we don't imply that unless there's pretty strong evidence.
And you kind of just touched on this, but I'm just curious to know if you think that we will ever definitively know the true origin of the virus, and how important is that discovery?
Yeah, I think that there's a good chance that we'll know. So if it was both naturally occurring, which it is, and naturally transmitted, let's say from the market down the street, we may never be able to prove that. There won't be a typhoid Mary, so to speak, that we can, zero in on and talk to. But if it was released from the lab in the alternative, intentionally or otherwise, we should be able to find evidence of that. I believe that's what our intelligence community is looking at now. You can talk to lab officials that may be disgruntled, doctors that worked at the lab that were observing their practices. One of the first key questions they'll have to ask is whether that lab was actually looking at and performing research on this virus. So we'll determine that, and then we'll determine through investigation. And if there is some link to the lab, we'll find it over time.
Tom Bossert, we always appreciate your insight. Thanks so much, as always.